welcome back. And if you're joining for the first time, I'm truly glad you're here. Tonight, as the world quiets down and shadows stretch longer across your walls, we'll take a journey together into a world both sacred and savage, legendary and all too real. Before we begin, I invite you to make yourself comfortable. Dim the lights, pour a warm drink, wrap yourself in something soft. This story is not told in haste. It moves slowly, like candlelight across stone. It was made for the hours when the rest of the world falls silent. If these quiet explorations bring you peace, I hope you'll consider subscribing. It helps keep this place alive. Now, picture this. You are a young man, perhaps 17, born into a modest, noble family in the cold hills of Burgundy. Your father is a minor lord. Your older brother will inherit everything. You, the second son, are offered two paths, the church or the sword. But one day, a preacher passes through your village. He does not speak of gold or glory or the crowns of kings. He speaks of Jerusalem, of sacred duty, of a life dedicated not to comfort, but to God. He wears a white mantle with a crimson cross. His eyes seem older than his face. He speaks of brotherhood, of sacrifice, of honor. That night your decision is made. You leave home, never to return. You make your way across the continent, through forests, mountains, and walled cities, to a port on the Mediterranean. There, you board a ship bound for the Holy Land. The sea is cruel. You vomit for days. You pray for calm. You learn quickly that hardship is not the exception, it is the rule. When you arrive in Acre, the air is dry and heavy with incense and sweat. You're taken to a fortress built from yellow stone, its walls thick and sun-bleached. Inside are men like you, silent, stern, clad in white. They do not smile. They do not laugh. They hand you garments and shave your head. The rule is read to you. 72 clauses. No personal possessions. No speaking during meals. No soft bedding. No meat unless you are ill. No idle words. No leaving the house without permission. You are now a Templar. You kneel. You swear eternal poverty, chastity, and obedience. You are told your life belongs to Christ, but your body belongs to the order. You do not fight yet. First, you clean. You scrub floors. You polish armor. You wake before sunrise and kneel until your legs shake. You eat in silence while a monk reads from Scripture. You sleep in your tunic on straw. You sweat. You itch. You obey. You learn to ride without reins. You learn to charge without fear. You learn to die without question. And all the while, the words echo in your head. Non nobis, Domini, non nobis, sed nomini tuo da gloriam. Not unto us, O Lord, not unto us, but to your name give glory. You see your first battle. The Saracens do not fear you. Their archers sing death from across the sand. You ride in formation, shoulder to shoulder, chanting prayers as arrows strike your brothers. You are told to hold the line, even when the enemy outnumbers you 3-1. You do not flee. You are wounded, not deeply, but enough to scar. The healer pours wine into the cut. You do not scream. You are praised, quietly. A nod from your superior, nothing more. There are no medals, no songs. You are reminded, glory is vanity, pain is sacred, and death is reward. And so, day by day, year by year, your soul is forged into something else, something unrecognizable to the boy who once walked the fields of Burgundy. You are now a blade, sharpened for use, not for your glory, for theirs. This is the beginning of your life as a Templar knight, and tonight we will walk that path together. Let's begin. Before we can understand the Templars, before we speak of swords and rituals, vows and betrayals, we must step into the world that birthed them. It was a world where God was not merely worshipped. He was feared. Where kings bowed to popes, where the line between heaven and earth ran straight through the altar of a cathedral, and where heresy wasn't disagreement, it was death. Religion wasn't a part of life, it was life. Every joy, every sorrow, every punishment, and every reward was attributed to the divine. Nothing was random. Nothing was yours. The 11th century in Western Europe was not a single realm, but a patchwork of petty kingdoms, duchies, bishoprics, and feudal domains. Allegiances shifted as often as the seasons. The idea of a unified nation was as foreign as flight. Lords ruled by the sword, and justice was a thing more prayed for than practiced. Authority was local, tenuous, and often brutal. A lord might settle a dispute with a feast or a hanging. If you angered him, your best hope was penance. Your worst outcome, a public death. Life for the common man was unforgiving. The land was worked by hand, the body worn by hunger, the mind bent beneath the weight of superstition. A good year meant survival. A bad year meant a shallow grave. Most people never traveled more than 10 miles from where they were born. Most never saw a book, never learned to read, never heard music that wasn't sung by a passing minstrel or chanted in a chapel. They lived in thatch-roofed huts, shared space with animals, and relied on seasonal rhythms not just for farming, but for hope. The rhythm of their life was one of labor, obedience, and the constant fear of divine punishment. Children died before naming. Mothers died in childbirth. Teeth rotted by 30. Arthritis bowed backs by 40. Life expectancy hovered near what we would now call adolescence. Illness was not an anomaly. It was expected. Simple infections became death sentences. And yet, in the face of this relentless fragility, people endured. They loved. They married. They sang. They hoped. And above all, they believed. Not because belief made life easier, but because it was the only light in the dark. Plague arrived without warning. Famine settled like a fog. War tore through the countryside with the indifference of weather. Fire could erase a village in a night. Wolves still hunted beyond the tree line. Winter killed the weak and reminded the strong that spring was not promised. And through it all, one institution reigned: the church. It did not bring comfort. It brought structure and certainty. But this was not the church of quiet prayers and soft hymns. This was a church of iron discipline, gilded ritual, and absolute authority. To defy the priest was to risk your soul. To question a bishop was to risk your life. The cathedral was not only taller than any home, it was more permanent than any crown. Carved from stone and echoing with Latin chants, it represented eternity in a world full of decay. Its walls were thick, its statues cold, its shadows long. It was less sanctuary than throne. Mass was conducted in a language understood only by the learned, but revered by all. It didn't matter if the words were incomprehensible. Their power came not from meaning, but from mystery. And mystery, in a world of pain, was a kind of hope, a balm for the unimaginable, a tether to something greater than suffering. The smoke of incense, the flicker of candlelight, the solemn hymns, all served to remind the people of their place beneath heaven. The church dictated not only faith, but time itself. It decided when one could marry, fast, feast, or bury the dead. It granted indulgences and excommunications. It sanctified kings and condemned heretics. Its grip was not tight. It was total. From the cradle to the grave and beyond, the church owned your soul. There was no justice without its blessing, no legitimacy without its name. It was the heart of law, of power, of knowledge, and of fear. And in this world, a new rumor began to spread of a city far away where heaven had once touched the earth. The rumor that spread through Europe was not just of a city, it was of a promise that salvation could be earned not by silence and submission, but by sword and sacrifice. In a world obsessed with the afterlife, this was no small thing. Eternal life had always been sold at the price of humility. Now it could be claimed through blood. That city was Jerusalem. Jerusalem, the place where Christ had walked, where prophets had spoken, where the heavens were believed to have opened. It was more than geography. It was the navel of the spiritual world, the center of divine history, a city layered in legend and sacred memory, and by the late 11th century it had fallen into the hands of those Western Europe called infidels, the Seljuk Turks, recent conquerors of the Islamic world's eastern flank. The fall of the city was not recent, nor especially violent, but the memory of it was stoked, reshaped, and inflamed by rhetoric. But the story of the Crusades begins not in the East, but in France. At the Council of Clermont in 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd of nobles, knights, and clerics. He did not plead. He summoned. With booming voice and pointed hand, he declared that Christendom itself was under attack, that brothers in the East were suffering, that the Holy Land, cradle of the Church, must be reclaimed, not for land, not for glory, but for God. He spoke of atrocities, some real, many exaggerated, of churches burned, Christians enslaved, sacred spaces defiled. He painted a picture of horror and offered an answer soaked in righteousness. He offered absolution, forgiveness of all sins, for those who took up the cross. He framed the coming war not as conquest, but as pilgrimage, not as vengeance, but as virtue, not as a military campaign, but a path to eternal salvation. The response was electric. Deus vult, they shouted. God wills it. Thousands answered, some noble, some poor, some pious, some hungry, but all swept into a tide of religious fervor. Crusading became the obsession of Europe, not just for kings and counts, but for butchers and bakers. It was both a holy duty and an escape from debt, from law, from obscurity, from sin. Mothers wept as their sons rode away. Villages emptied. Entire lineages vanished into the East. The movement was more than military. It was cultural, spiritual, emotional. It redefined the concept of Christian virtue. Piety now wore a sword. The First Crusade was chaos, poorly organized, ill-equipped. Entire bands perished before reaching Constantinople. And yet, by miracle or madness, they pressed on, across Anatolia, through heat, starvation, ambush, and siege. They fought not just enemies, but terrain, hunger, internal conflict, betrayal. They besieged Antioch and took it, only to be besieged themselves. They discovered relics in the dirt, claimed visions from angels, and slaughtered towns that would not yield. And somehow, impossibly, they made it to Jerusalem. In 1099, against all odds, the city fell. But it did not fall quietly. The city was bathed in blood. Christian chroniclers described wading through corpses. Streets ran red. No distinction was made between soldier and civilian, between child and man, between Jew, Muslim, or Eastern Christian. Men who had wept at the sight of the Holy Sepulchre now crushed skulls in its shadow. The city was liberated, but at a terrible cost. To the Crusaders, it was victory. To the survivors, it was apocalypse. The horrors of the sack of Jerusalem would echo in the memories of the Muslim world for generations. What emerged was not peace, but tension. Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, were carved into the map like fresh wounds. They were bold, exposed, and surrounded by enemies. Their borders were constantly probed. Their roads were often impassable. Their rulers were foreign and deeply resented. And pilgrims still came, drawn by faith, by hope, by the scent of salvation. But the road was no safer than before. Bandits roamed freely. Whole caravans were attacked. Pilgrims disappeared without trace. What protected the soul had not yet learned to protect the body. And so the stage was set, not just for a new war, but for a new kind of warrior. The need was simple but urgent. Protect the pilgrims. These were not warriors. These were ordinary souls, traveling across hostile lands to glimpse the sacred stones of Jerusalem. They came barefoot, some half-starved, others maimed by the journey. They came not to conquer, but to pray, and too often they never arrived. The Holy Land, as envisioned by Western Europe, had been liberated, but in practice it remained wild, fractured, and deeply dangerous. Bandits haunted the passes. Mercenaries preyed on the weak. Desert raiders attacked with precision, vanishing into the heat. And even within Christian strongholds, law was patchy at best. The roads that led to salvation were lined with corpses. The so-called liberated land was no safer than it had ever been, and perhaps even more volatile. What was needed was not another army, but something different, something devoted, something permanent, something that could fuse the spiritual discipline of the church with the hard edge of military steel. In 1119, a knight named Hugues de Payan, alongside 8 companions, proposed a radical solution to King Baldwin II of Jerusalem. Their offer was austere, absolute, and unprecedented. They would not merely fight, they would embody a new idea: warrior monks, holy men with swords, fighters with vows. They would form a brotherhood, monastic in discipline, but martial in mission. They would live as monks, celibate, poor, obedient, but they would fight as knights, trained, relentless, and unafraid of death. Their cause was sacred, their duty divine. These men took no wives, owned no property, slept in shared quarters, wore simple robes, when not donning chainmail. Their lives were governed by prayer, training, and readiness for combat. They fasted, they confessed, they drilled. They pledged themselves to the defense of pilgrims and the service of Christ. Their first headquarters was a set of quarters on the Temple Mount itself, believed to stand upon the ruins of Solomon's temple, a site already soaked in religious weight and mystical symbolism. From that sacred ground, they took their name, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. But the world would come to know them by a shorter title, the Knights Templar. They were poor in coin, but rich in purpose. They wore white cloaks, later emblazoned with a red cross. They moved in silence, rode in pairs, and spoke only when necessary. Their austerity was not a limitation. It was a declaration, a rejection of worldly luxury, a statement that their strength came not from gold or glory, but from the purity of their mission. And that mission had only just begun. At first, the Knights Templar were few, unknown, uncelebrated, and largely ignored by the broader Christian world. They begged for alms. They owned no land. Their influence extended no farther than the walls of Jerusalem. But within a decade, everything began to change. In 1129, at the Council of Troy, the Templars received formal recognition from the Church. With the backing of Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most powerful and revered monks of the time, their mission was sanctified, their rules codified, and their image transformed from obscurity to spiritual elite. Bernard's endorsement was no small thing. His words described the Templars not merely as knights, but as holy instruments of divine will. In his treatise, in praise of the new knighthood, he contrasted them with worldly warriors, those who fought for vanity and gold. The Templars, he claimed, fought a nobler war, one for the soul, one with eternal stakes. With this papal and public blessing, donations flooded in. Nobles gifted the order with land, castles, and entire estates across Europe. Fields, vineyards, mills, and ports were placed under their control. The Templars were no longer just guardians of pilgrims. They were becoming a financial and logistical powerhouse. Their network grew, not just in the Holy Land, but across France, England, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire. They built commanderies, regional outposts that served as farms, training centers, and recruitment hubs. From these, resources were gathered and funneled east to support the war effort. Their reputation for discipline and incorruptibility made them ideal stewards of wealth. Pilgrims entrusted them with money. Kings employed them as bankers. By the mid-12th century, the Knights Templar were running an early form of international banking, issuing letters of credit, safeguarding deposits, and facilitating long-distance transfers of funds. But with growth came change. The humble warriors of 1119 were becoming administrators, landlords, and diplomats. Their responsibilities multiplied. So did their influence. And with that influence came attention and envy. Strip away the cross. Strip away the myth. What remains is a man, a Templar knight, breathing beneath the weight of armor and expectation. He wakes before the sun, not to the sound of birds, but the call to prayer. The chapel is cold, stone beneath his knees. The silence is broken only by breath and ritual. Before he lifts a sword, he lifts a prayer. His life begins not with ambition, but submission to God, to order, to his brothers. His body is trained but not pampered. He eats little, sleeps little. His hands are calloused from reins and weapons alike. His shoulders ache from chainmail. His back bears the bruises of discipline. He is no brute, yet no scholar. His literacy, if any, serves only the reading of psalms. His mind is molded not by curiosity, but by obedience. A slow, relentless shaping like stone worn by wind. He wears white, a symbol of purity. But over his heart, a red cross bleeds across the fabric. It is not merely a sign. It is a mark of death, a reminder that he has sworn to lay down his life and to take others, not for king, nor for coin, but for God. That red cross is not decoration. It is a promise sealed in blood. He fights in formation, rides in pairs, and moves without question. His world is rules: when to pray, when to ride, when to eat, when to kill. There is discipline, yes, but more than that, there is surrender. The Templar Knight is not his own. He is not allowed identity. He is not allowed indulgence. His life is a ledger of obedience, written in duty. He is what remains when ego is burned away, when family, pleasure, ambition, and fear are nailed to the altar. What remains is duty and steel. He has no legacy to pass on, no stories told in taverns. He vanishes into service so the idea may endure. He does not boast. He does not waver. He does not expect praise. His victories are buried with the fallen, his failures confessed at dusk. At night his dreams are brief, flickers of silence between prayers. Even in rest he is vigilant. And yet within this hardness there lives a flicker of something softer, a longing, not for comfort, but for meaning, for the quiet certainty that his suffering serves a purpose. Perhaps he thinks of home, of green hills, a mother's song, a distant brother who took a different path. But the thought is fleeting. Regret is weakness. Doubt is sin. He is not a hero, nor a villain. He is a vessel, a blade forged by faith, a soul pressed into shape by oath. He is the echo of a vow that never leaves his lips. Only his scars speak for him. A Templar knight does not walk alone. Though solitude marks his spirit, fraternity defines his path. He is always one among many, a drop in a tide of white cloaks and steel eyes. They ride 2 by 2, eat at common tables, pray in unison. Their beds are aligned like tombs, close but separate. No curtains, no privacy, no illusions of self. The rule of the Templar forbade all signs of vanity, all luxuries of individuality. Even their horses were shared, not owned, not chosen, simply assigned. One man slept while the other stood guard. One held the reins while the other drew his blade. Within this order, there are no friendships in the worldly sense. There is loyalty, the kind that lives in silence and dies in silence. A nod in the dust, a hand on the shoulder before battle, a shared glance that says, "If I fall, carry the mission, not my name." They do not chant songs of conquest. They recite scripture, psalms and penance, their voices low, rhythmic, and resolute. They confess not to boast, but to cleanse. And when one of them breaks, when the fear, the blood, or the loneliness becomes too heavy, He does not cry aloud. He kneels. Punishment is not cruelty. It is correction. Silence is not emptiness. It is discipline. Every moment not spent in prayer or combat is spent in preparation for both. Even laughter is subdued, rare, a flicker before it is extinguished. To be a Templar is to be folded into something larger. Your breath joins the rhythm. Your step matches the beat. You vanish in the line so the line may endure. Not all Templars were foot soldiers of faith. Some, over time, bore more than swords. They carried decisions, orders, doubt. Leadership within the order was not a prize to be sought. It was a burden, elected, not inherited, assigned, not desired. The master of a commandery or of the entire order was chosen for discipline, not charisma, for steadiness, not brilliance. A man with no ambition was the safest man to trust with power. To command meant to calculate risk with holy stakes. One wrong decision could lose a caravan, a fortress, a dozen lives, or more. And when mistakes were made, there was no one else to blame. No public shame, no shouts, only the quiet silence of men you failed. Leaders ate the same food, slept in the same barracks, took the same vows, and yet they were set apart, not by privilege, but by the unbearable weight of knowing every command bore a cost. When to retreat, when to charge, when to hold the line. Each command was written in consequence. They kept ledgers not just of supplies and grain, but of death, of brothers buried, of enemies pardoned, of oaths fulfilled. They read letters from kings and popes, trying to sift divine purpose from politics. They navigated alliances with monarchs, bartered for safe passage, inspected siege equipment, and still they prayed. Power for a Templar leader was isolation in armor. Respected, yes, but rarely loved. Surrounded, but always alone. Outwardly, the Templar knight was ironclad. Inwardly, he was human. There were no words for anxiety, no space for tears, but fear still lived beneath the helmet. It surfaced in the clenched jaw before battle, in the stiff breath before sleep. It surfaced when he sharpened his sword in silence and wondered, not whether he would die, but whether his death would matter. The mind of a Templar was a battlefield of its own. Discipline fought with doubt. Pride wrestled with humility. And as the order grew in wealth and global reach, some knights felt the ground shift beneath their feet. The mission blurred. The vow grew heavier. A knight might begin to question the opulence of new commanderies, the politics of papal alliances, the blurred line between soldier and banker. But there was no forum to speak, no ears trained to hear dissent. So the questions stayed buried, and the silence, once sacred, began to suffocate. Some broke under pressure, quietly, discreetly, a departure here, a confession there, a dull stare in morning prayer. Some abandoned the order. Others stayed but vanished internally. They became shadows among shadows, going through motions, their souls already disarmed. And when a brother fell into disobedience or despair, the punishment was swift. not for cruelty, but to preserve the purity of the whole. One infected limb could not be allowed to spread rot. The greater body must endure. Yet even in collapse, a knight rarely cursed his oath. His failure, if he named it at all, was not in taking the vow, but in not living up to it. In falling short of a standard he still believed in. That is perhaps the tragedy of the Templar, not that they were used, but that they were believers. By the mid-12th century, the Knights Templar had become more than warriors. They were an institution, structured, far-reaching, and remarkably efficient. What began as a handful of men in Jerusalem had morphed into a multinational network stretching from the Holy Land to the furthest cathedrals of Western Europe. Their rise was not by conquest, but by support. Nobles donated land. Kings issued charters. Popes granted privileges. And with each gift, the order grew, not just in men, but in wealth, influence, and logistical might. They owned vineyards in France, farms in England, ports in Italy, and castles in Spain. Their commanderies became hubs of productivity and control, part monastery, part fortress, part administrative center. These were not merely outposts. They were engines, interconnected cells of faith and force, strategically positioned and meticulously organized. Templar logistics were legendary. They could mobilize men, horses, weapons, and grain faster than many royal armies. They created supply chains that spanned continents. A knight departing Paris could travel to Acre and find food, shelter, and fresh mounts waiting, all provided by his brethren. They maintained armories, hospitals, and supply depots. They moved caravans with the precision of state-run operations. They mapped routes, fortified roads, and trained replacements before they were needed. Behind every sword was a scroll. Behind every banner, a balance sheet. The order's ability to execute operations was so refined that historians today liken it to the earliest forms of military-industrial logistics. Their financial practices were even more astonishing. Pilgrims entrusted them with money before setting off on the long road east. In return, the Templars gave them letters of credit, the medieval precursor to modern banking. A man could deposit gold in London and withdraw its value in Jerusalem without ever touching coin again until his return. This trust extended beyond pilgrims. They lent money to kings, managed estates, collected taxes. They became guardians of wealth not only for the church, but for the powerful. Their coffers grew, and with them so did suspicion. They minted coins, balanced ledgers, guarded vaults. The Red Cross became a symbol not just of faith, but of finance, and eventually of economic might. And yet for a time, their power was seen not as a threat, but as providence. They were the holy engine behind Christendom's eastern frontier, the armored arm of the Church. Their silence was mistaken for humility, their efficiency for divine favor. As long as the Crusades burned hot, the Order's flame burned brighter still, and no one dared question how they kept the fire alive. With their efficiency and piety, the Templars became more than a military force. They became a symbol. Monarchs saw them as allies, the Church as instruments of divine justice. In royal courts, they were whispered about with both reverence and calculation. To have Templars nearby was to signal order, strength, and godly favor. The privileges granted to them were staggering. They answered only to the Pope, bypassing kings and bishops alike. No taxes, no tithes. They could cross borders freely, bear arms without restriction, build fortifications, and try members in their own courts. In an age of rigid feudal chains, they moved almost unbound, nearly sovereign within sovereign realms. And so they expanded. New recruits flowed in. Not all were of noble birth. Some were drawn by faith, others by the promise of purpose. The order grew into a network of cells, each bound by rule, oath, and shared vision. They spoke different tongues, came from distant lands, but shared the same uniform, the same prayers, the same silence before battle. Templar training was relentless. Recruits endured months of isolation, discipline, and indoctrination. They were stripped of vanity, taught to ride, fight, and obey. The few who remained emerged, not as men with pasts, but as vessels for the present cause, and once accepted, they were never truly free again. Inside their walls, rituals governed everything, from the way they sat at meals to how they cared for their wounds. Silence was sacred, eyes forward, speech rationed, laughter rare. They trained in every weather, practiced formation before sunrise, rode drills until dusk. The code they followed was not just a guide. It was the architecture of their very being. The world saw their white mantles and red crosses and saw angels of war. But inside the order it was different, more human, more brutal, more demanding. Because to be a Templar was not to shine. It was to disappear, to become the mission, to surrender identity for impact. And yet, as their coffers swelled and their lands multiplied, envy began to fester. Whispers turned to rumors, and though the Templars remained untouchable for now, the stage was slowly, imperceptibly, being set for the shadows that would follow. As the Templars rose in stature, they found themselves walking a delicate tightrope between church and crown. They were answerable to the Pope, and yet indispensable to kings. This dual allegiance made them both invaluable and resented. Monarchs could not command them, yet relied on their counsel, protection, and, increasingly, their money. Templars were entrusted with guarding royal treasuries. They transported state secrets across borders. They loaned fortunes to rulers, some of whom found themselves indebted to men they could neither command nor easily dismiss. In England, in France, in the Holy Roman Empire, the white mantle was seen in courts just as often as on battlefields. This convergence of spiritual authority, financial clout, and military power was unprecedented and unsettling. Some whispered that the Templars were becoming a church within the church. Others believed they were quietly amassing the means to rival monarchies themselves. Yet the Templars themselves did not boast. They did not erect statues or monuments. Their castles were functional, their ceremonies austere. If pride existed, it was buried under layers of discipline. And yet, even without seeking it, they had become one of the most powerful institutions in the Western world. They held influence over trade routes, pilgrimage paths, and even papal elections. In some regions, a Templar commander had more sway than local lords. Their neutrality made them trusted. Their reach made them feared. They brokered peace between rivals, negotiated hostage returns, and safeguarded relics. With that power came dangerous visibility. Their red cross, once a symbol of piety, now stirred unease. For those who envied them, it was a banner of arrogance. For those who feared them, it was a sign of unchecked ambition. And for those in debt to them, it was a reminder of chains they could not break. Still, the Templars pressed on. They built, they trained, they served, and they believed, perhaps more than anyone else, that their cause was righteous and their mission eternal. But eternity has enemies. The higher the climb, the steeper the fall. And though the Templars could not yet see it, the seeds of their undoing had already taken root. Their castles, once viewed as bastions of faith, began to resemble fortresses of defiance. Their wealth, once admired, became a source of bitter envy, and their independence, once celebrated, became their most dangerous trait. In some corners of Europe, resentment smoldered. Local lords, unable to tax or command the Templars, grew restless. Bishops bristled at being bypassed. Kings saw their growing debt not as a misstep, but as a humiliation. The Templars did not scheme, but their very existence disrupted the fragile balance of power. To the people, the order still shone as defenders of Christ, but in courtly halls, behind closed doors, their names sparked quieter tones. Respect laced with fear, admiration tinged with suspicion. They had become what no power structure tolerates for long, a third pillar. Neither crown nor church, yet beholden to neither. A global, wealthy, mobile force of armed men who answered only to God. And God, unlike kings, could not be bribed, threatened, or dethroned. The Holy Land was beginning to slip away. Crusader victories grew fewer. Christian holdings in Jerusalem and surrounding regions eroded under counteroffensives. And as the cause faltered, so too did the justification for the order's vast resources. What once looked like divine blessing began to look like hoarding. Their treasure, their properties, their networks, once assets in war, now became liabilities in peace. People began to ask, why do they still need so much? Who do they really serve now? They were no longer crusaders. They were bankers, landlords, bureaucrats in chainmail. Their enemy was no longer the infidel. It was public perception. The faithful had once kissed their crosses. Now, they whispered behind closed doors. And then came a new king, clever, ambitious, drowning in debt. A man who looked at the Templars not with awe, but with calculation. The shadows that once whispered now gathered mass. And in the corners of candle-lit courts, within the marble corridors of palaces, a question took shape. What if the Templars were no longer necessary? Worse yet, what if they were dangerous? The king in question was Philip IV of France, cunning, burdened by war debts, and drawn like a moth to the gold he could not possess. He owed the Templars more than coin. He owed them pride, power, and independence, things no king surrenders easily. Philip did not act alone. He consulted lawyers, whispered to clergy, lured inquisitors into his orbit. He didn't need an army to destroy the Templars. He needed a story, a scandal, a sin. Accusations were crafted in the dark. Heresy, idol worship, sodomy, spitting on the cross. charges so vile, so theatrical. They were meant not for truth, but for fear. And fear, once ignited, spreads without mercy. On Friday the 13th of October, 1307, the trap was sprung. At dawn across France, Templars were arrested, hundreds of them. The sword was not drawn. It was legal parchment that cut deepest. The order was caught off guard. Many believed the Pope would intervene. He did not. Under torture, confessions were extracted, not truth, but the theater of guilt. Men confessed to lies just to make the pain stop. Others stayed silent and vanished into dungeons. Templar properties were seized, libraries raided, treasuries emptied. Their symbols were scraped from walls, their graves defaced. A brotherhood that had stretched across continents now found itself hunted, even within its own sanctuaries. But it was not just the arrests. It was the reversal. Yesterday's defenders of Christendom were now painted as its enemies. In the span of days, public opinion, once reverent, became indifferent or complicit. Silence fell not just from fear, but fatigue. The world was ready to move on. The Templars were not. It would take years, trials, papal decrees, secret councils. But the end had begun, and for an order that prided itself on control, discipline, and divine mission, their fall would be chaotic, humiliating, and irreversible. The mighty had become the accused, and the weight of their own legend would now crush them. The Templar trials were not swift executions of justice. They were drawn-out performances, a theater of power where truth mattered far less than spectacle. What began as arrests quickly morphed into a long, orchestrated attempt to dismantle the order's dignity, piece by piece. One by one, the leaders were paraded before inquisitors. Among them was Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, a man who had fought for decades, dined with kings, and now stood stripped of armor, shackled, aged, and exposed to ridicule. He confessed, under torture, to crimes that echoed the accusations, denying Christ, kissing initiates in forbidden places, worshipping strange idols, but he soon recanted. And for that recantation, he would pay a different price, the slow burn of forgotten loyalties and shifting alliances. The Pope, Clement V, walked a razor's edge. He had once been friendly to the order, but under pressure from Philip IV, his resolve wavered. Bulls were issued, trials expanded, orders suppressed. Templars across Europe were imprisoned, interrogated, and in many cases abandoned. Some broke completely, their bodies giving out before their wills. Others clung to silence, their loyalty becoming their sentence. The public by now had turned away. The once fabled knights who had ridden into battle under the sign of the cross now stood in rags, accused of unholy acts, with no battlefield to prove their innocence. The greatest humiliation was not death, it was erasure. The slow, methodical deletion of their name, their symbols, their presence in the memory of nations. The order was not destroyed with swords, but with ink and fire. And yet, Even as the walls closed in, the silence of some Templars held firm. It was not defiance, not pride. It was belief in the vows they'd sworn, in the cause they'd lived for, in the brotherhood they could not betray. Even as history turned against them, by 1312, the fate of the Templars was no longer a question of guilt or innocence. It was a matter of convenience. The Church, fractured by its own compromises, officially dissolved the order through the papal bull Vox in Excelso. No formal judgment was passed, no vindication offered, just silence, approval, a nod to royal wishes. Many Templars had perished in captivity. Others had been absorbed into different orders or faded into rural obscurity. Their commanderies were handed over to the Hospitallers or seized outright by monarchs. The vast Templar network was undone not with fire, but with redistribution. And yet, the fire came. In 1314, Jacques de Molay and Geoffroy de Charny, two of the last remaining leaders, were led to a small island in the Seine, bound to stakes and burned alive. Their final words were not curses, but declarations of innocence and loyalty. De Molay's voice, ragged and scorched, was said to have echoed across the waters. God knows who is wrong and has sinned. Witnesses claimed the sky turned gray. Some said the air stood still. Others whispered of curses, how Philip IV and Clement V would both be dead within a year. Whether divine vengeance or coincidence, both prophecies proved true. But what mattered more than omens was the legacy, the order of the Temple, once the sword and vault of Christendom, was no more. But its memory endured, not as a cautionary tale, but as a spark. In the decades that followed, legends multiplied, stories of hidden treasures, secret rituals, survivors in exile. The Templars vanished from power, but entered myth, and myth, unlike marble, does not crack. Their silence had failed to save them, but it made them eternal. The Templars were gone, but the world they helped shape continued. Their castles became the bones of new kingdoms. Their banking practices, once revolutionary, laid the groundwork for future economies, and their legend only grew stronger in absence. But what remained behind was more than myth. It was a lingering question. How could an order so vast, so disciplined, so beloved, fall so completely? Rulers took note. The papacy, shaken by its role in the dissolution, became more cautious about empowering independent military orders. No successor rose in the Templars' place. Not truly. The void they left was too immense and too dangerous to refill. In the decades that followed, paranoia lingered. Kings kept a tighter grip on religious movements. The Church reinforced its bureaucracies. Even whispers of a new crusading order were met with suspicion. And yet, the legacy of the Templars found strange roots in Masonic lodges, in esoteric writings, in conspiracy theories whispered across centuries. They became ghosts that haunted not just Europe, but imagination itself. The order had died in fire and silence, but it refused to be buried. As centuries passed, the physical remnants of the Templars began to fade, but their legend did the opposite. With each retelling, their image transformed, from devout knights of the cross to enigmatic keepers of secret wisdom. What the sword could not preserve, the story did. Writers of the Enlightenment romanticized them as tragic heroes, victims of political greed and church hypocrisy. In the Age of Revolution, they became symbols of resistance to tyranny. In the occult revival of the 18th and 19th centuries, they were portrayed as guardians of ancient knowledge, hidden rites, and forbidden truths. Templar symbols resurfaced in unexpected places, carved into churches, referenced in rituals, stitched into Masonic regalia. Entire societies claimed lineage from their ashes. Whether true or fabricated, it did not matter. The absence of clarity became the soil in which imagination grew wild. Even in popular culture, they endured, depicted in novels, films, video games, and conspiracy thrillers. Treasure hunters sought their gold. Secret societies claimed their codes. Historians, mystics, and charlatans alike chased their ghosts. In every shadowy corridor of European history, a Templar footprint was imagined, sometimes falsely, sometimes plausibly. They became the eternal riddle. What did they truly know? What did they hide? What did they become? Their fall may have ended their political reality, but it launched their mythological eternity. Few institutions in human history have died with such violence and risen with such immortality. In the centuries that followed, the silence left behind by the Templars took on a life of its own. It became a mirror in which every generation projected its fears, hopes, and conspiracies. Where facts ended, fascination began. Some claim the Templars survived in secret, continuing their mission underground, preserving relics, guarding bloodlines, influencing revolutions. Others saw in them the seeds of new orders, Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, even Illuminati. The truth was irrelevant. The idea was immortal. Their symbolism transcended borders. The red cross, the sealed lips, the white mantle, these became icons, etched into architecture, printed on flags, whispered in coded language. They passed from chroniclers to poets, from historians to novelists, growing larger, stranger, more powerful in death than they had been in life. This mythic aura gave the Templars something no army or crown ever could: timeless relevance. In moments of upheaval, people invoked them. In times of control, people feared them. In eras of darkness, people imagined them as keepers of light. And so the silence endured, not as a void, but as an echo. In the end, the Templars lost their lands, their titles, and their flesh, but they gained something rarer: a place in the collective imagination of mankind. Not as saints, not as villains, but as a question that refuses to fade. Their greatest victory was not in battle, it was in memory. The tale of the Templars is not just one of swords and kings. It is a lesson etched into the bones of history. It is about power left unchecked, loyalty exploited, and silence used as both shield and sentence. In their rise, we see the power of unity and vision. In their fall, the peril of envy and betrayal. What was lost was not only a brotherhood, but an idea, a belief that men could dedicate themselves fully, not to conquest or wealth, but to something they believed sacred. Whether that cause remained pure is for history to debate, but their commitment was undeniable. And yet, even those who wore the white mantle could not escape the corruption of systems. the same walls they built to protect Christendom were used to imprison them. The same kings they had shielded turned on them. The same silence that bound them became their tomb. Their story is a mirror for every age, every regime, every soul that seeks purpose beyond the self. It asks, what will you fight for? And what, when the time comes, will you remain silent about? The red cross of the Templars was never just a symbol of faith. It was a burden, a mark of discipline, secrecy, and sacrifice. It demanded everything and gave little in return. To carry it meant giving up family, ambition, self. It meant vanishing into a life of obedience, warfare, and spiritual austerity. For many, that sacrifice gave them meaning. For others, it gave them a cell. And still they carried it, across deserts, over mountains, through the halls of kings and the trenches of siege engines. Even when the church turned, even when the flames rose, they carried it. Perhaps that is why the world remembers them, not because they won, but because they endured, because they believed, because they fell, not as tyrants, but as believers caught in the machinery of a changing world. In the end, history did not record the names of every Templar who died. Most were buried without stones, their vows echoing only in forgotten halls. But somewhere, in the echoes of those ruins, one might imagine a final knight, nameless, faceless, still standing vigil. He is not waiting for redemption, not for revenge, only for understanding. A soul still asking the question, was it worth it? And perhaps that is the real legacy of the Templars. Not gold, not secrets, not conspiracies, but that question. In a world of shifting truths and fleeting loyalties, theirs is a story that forces us to ask, what do we serve? And how long are we willing to stand for it? In silence.